Hi everybody, and welcome to Module 9, where we're going to talk about economic geography. The way the book divides up this section is they take economic geography and break it into two parts, so we're going to do the same thing in terms of modules here. Where in the first section we're going to look at agriculture and food systems, and then in the second module, well, the book looks a little more at industrial location and that sort of thing, and then the way I have it structured is that Module 10 will actually be a little more about development, economic development, and the global economy. So there's some divergence from the book there in Module 10, but Module 9 is pretty close, and then I'm going to focus here on agriculture. So here's the key points that we're going to talk about in this module. Number one, talk a little bit about definitions and the concept of economic sectors. Secondly, we'll talk about the importance and briefly skim over some of the types of agriculture. Third, we'll talk about how agriculture is arranged around cities. Something called the von Thunen model is a model of how agriculture is arranged near cities. And then lastly, talk a little bit about technology and change in agriculture and the very major impacts that this has on people's livelihoods and also on geography, on the way the world is made. So, all right, so to start right off, we're going to start with key point number one here, which is about definitions and economic sectors. So this is just this definition of economic geography, like what we're talking about when we mention economic geography. And it says here, the study of how people earn their living, how livelihood systems vary by area, and how economic activities are spatially interrelated and linked. And so the patterns of our livelihoods, like how we live and work and eat and all of that, are influenced by the physical environment, but also by our culture, our levels of technological development, also political decisions and economic factors, right, like market conditions, the demand for certain things. And of course, these are sort of concepts we've talked about in previous modules in terms of, talking about what kind of influence the physical environment has versus cultural considerations and all that. But it really plays out when we look at the agricultural landscape. So the first thing I want to talk about here is just the idea that there are different types of economic activities, of which agriculture is sort of one of them. So the way in which geographers and other social scientists look at these things is we divide up different economic activities into three, or nowadays kind of four, major categories. And the first one is primary activities. And this is essentially when you are extracting or getting value out of something from the natural world. So it's to harvest or extract something from the earth. Hunting, gathering, grazing, agriculture, fishing, mining, these kinds of things are the activities we call primary activities, because they're directly related to kind of going out and getting materials and making them have some use, some human use. Secondary activities are things that's more like industry or manufacturing. It's where we take those materials that we've already got from the earth, whether it be foodstuff or things from grazing or, forestry, and actually making something, right, or mining. So you take those things you mined in the primary sector, and in the secondary sector, you're taking that metal and you're fashioning it into some kind of product, like making cars, that kind of stuff. So think of it this way. This is kind of mostly like farming and mining. Secondary activities are much more like industrial activities. Then there are tertiary activities, which is actually what the U.S., is kind of the leading sector in the United States. This is providing services to the primary and secondary sectors. So this is people that are like kind of professionals, clerical, personal services. So like if you work in a store selling things to people, right, you're not in the primary, you're not out mining or growing the stuff. You're also not in manufacturing, you're not making the stuff. You're in the tertiary or third tier of the economy, which is about selling things to people or facilitating it. Working in education would be another kind of tertiary activity, kind of training people how to, to work in the other sectors of the economy, this kind of thing. Some people will now talk about what they call a quaternary or fourth sector, which has to do with information technology, like the people that are essentially keeping kind of manipulating information in terms of the way the economy works, people that are like in investment banking or high levels of education, that kind of stuff. But the book, I think, just kind of goes into these three for the most part. Okay, key point number two, the importance of agriculture. As we talked about in the population module, as we know, global food supplies right now are more than sufficient. The problem, of course, is uneven distribution. So the number of undernourished people is about 1 billion people. So we're talking about a sixth of humanity. suffers from undernourishment. And so it says here, the 30-year trend of reduced global hunger was reversed by the economic crisis that began in 2007. So hunger was getting better and better, but then the economic crisis kind of plunged things back downward a bit. And so this is still a very big concern. And so agriculture obviously is very important when we're talking about how do we feed our whole population. And the other thing too is, of course, all humans depend directly or indirectly on agriculture for their survival. Even if you were eating meat all the time, that meat is likely eating crops that were grown through agriculture. And so, and also when we talk about domesticated animals, we kind of usually include that in the agricultural sector, like livestock fattening or ranching and that kind of stuff. So the definition here of agriculture is the cultivation of domesticated crops and the raising of domesticated animals. And it remains the most important economic activity in the world, uses more land than any other activity, and employs about 40% of the working population. In the United States, we have a fairly small percentage of our population actually directly working in agriculture, less than 5%. But the United States is an anomaly. If you look globally, many more people are working in the agricultural sector. And this is just a little reminder. It says, despite all our accomplishments, we owe our existence to a 6-inch layer of topsoil and the fact that it rains. That's actually pretty true. So the book talks a little bit about the centers of where agriculture started. Agriculture is interesting as an innovation in that it started in several places at about the same time, between 7,000 and 9,000 years ago. It started in parts of the Middle East around the Fertile Crescent. It started in the valleys of China. It's not on here, but also the Indus River Valley here in Pakistan. Also in Mesoamerica, like in this part of Mexico and in the Andes, are places where agriculture all developed. And I should, mention that there's a difference between agriculture and hunting and gathering. Hunting and gathering is just going out and finding what you can and eating it. Whereas in agriculture, it's this planned process of you go and you plant things and then you cultivate it and then you harvest it when it's all done. And so agriculture is actually a bit of a technological innovation that humans had to develop, and then it diffused around the world. The other thing that you can see on this map is the green areas. These are the most productive agricultural areas today. So places like the Midwest of the US, Western Europe, the steppes of Russia and Ukraine, this part of India, as well as the area around Buenos Aires, Uruguay, and Brazil down here. Okay, so this is key point 2.5, sort of. This is stuff you really need to know, but I'm going to breeze through this on the video because it's it's about like just looking at the different kinds of agriculture and just knowing what they are and how they operate, and it can get a little dry and long for me to go over every one of these, so I'm really going to breeze through, but make sure that you focus on these different types, either from the book or from the PowerPoint. And I'm going to pause and relocate because where I'm standing, someone evidently is going to mow their lawn right now with a very loud lawnmower. So I'm going to pause. I'm back. Now, had to relocate to some place with a much less attractive background, but what can you do? So anyway, these different types of agriculture. So ones to know are things like, well, first of all, there's a difference between what we call extensive and intensive agriculture. Extensive means something happens over a really broad area. So, for instance, wheat growing in the United States is extensive. It's all over the place. It covers huge swaths of the United States. Intensive agriculture is putting a lot into a very small space. So if you have a garden in your backyard, that's probably intensive agriculture. You're growing some tomatoes and cucumbers and all these things like in a very small area. Now, agriculture can be both. Like, for instance, corn production in the United States, it's all over the place, covers large parts of Ohio and Illinois and Indiana and other areas in Iowa, but it's also for every square, meter that they're planting the stuff, they're also doing it very intensively. And so things can be kind of both ways. So the different types, things like Swidden cultivation, make sure you read over these PowerPoints. Basically, this is the same as slash and burn agriculture, and it's some of the earliest forms of agriculture that humans engaged in, and it's done in a lot of parts of the world. It's where you go in, you clear part of the forest, burn it, and then you plant crops in it, and then that usually only has good soil for a few years, and then you move on to another part of the forest. This is actually a fairly sustainable practice because if you go around to different places and then come back around to a place that you had been 20, 30 years ago, it had already regrown, and then you cut that down again farm it while the other places are regenerating. So it can be sustainable, but only if you have not that many people and quite a bit of land to do this. The problem with slash and burn or Swidden cultivation is when you start getting so many people and not enough land, and the landscape doesn't have time to actually adapt and to redevelop and restore itself between cycles of farming. So it, again, can be sustainable and it sometimes can't be. So anyway, again, can just come to the pros and cons. Make sure you look over this stuff. Another major type of farming is paddy rice farming. Huge areas of Asia, of course, rely on rice as their staple crop, and so this is a very important type of agriculture. Peasant grain, root and livestock farming is important. These are small-scale farmers that own their own fields, kind of like what in the U.S. we would kind of call family farms, or kind of more community-oriented farms in a lot of parts of the world. Still a pretty important way in which food is produced in many parts of the world. Plantation agriculture, of course, there's kind of a long history of plantations, particularly in the Caribbean, for like sugar production and that sort of thing. It's not as prevalent now, but of course was a big way in which agriculture production occurred for many, many years. So make sure that you understand that one. And then market gardening, or truck farming, is about farming devoted to specialized fruit, vegetable, or vine crops for sale rather than consumption. So the reason it's market gardening is it's not for you, it's for selling. This is the kind of agriculture we pretty much have here in New England. People that have like apple orchards or other kinds of agricultural products or maple syruping operations, that kind of thing. That's market gardening, essentially. There's also livestock fattening is another kind of agriculture, and we separate fattening from grazing because fattening is really about taking all the cows that may have grazed a little bit when they were younger, putting them into what were called feedlots, and just feeding them corn or whatever, or soy and all sorts of other stuff, and just making them fatter through feeding them agricultural products. If you've ever had the chance to drive through a place that has these kinds of feedlots, they smell absolutely horrific. I've driven through like West Texas, through these kind of areas, and it is god-awful. Grain farming, of course, is another big one, like wheat production, like corn production. Corn is, of course, one of the biggest in the United States. And just to give you an idea of how prevalent grain production is, the food supply for over 85% of the world's population comes from only 20 species. So things like corn, wheat, rice, right? Those sort of things makes up the major part of the diet of most people in the world. So it's actually genetically not a very genetically diverse food production system that we have currently. And this is just a map showing kind of the large wheat producers in the world. Another concept that's important to know is the one called suitcase farms. This is how most grain farms actually operate in the United States. It's not the mom and pop family farm anymore. Those people have been essentially kind of bought out and sent off the land, and now workers come with a suitcase, come in, they do all the planting, usually with machinery, leave while the crop grows, and then come back and just harvest it. But nobody actually lives in these areas anymore, so it's caused a lot of depopulation around the western parts of the Great Plains. But that's where a lot of agriculture gets done now in the US and Canada. Another kind of agriculture, which of course is big here in New England, is dairying. But in other parts of the world, dairying is usually sedentary, done in one particular place, whereas in a lot of parts of the world you still have nomadic herding, where people are moving their herds over long distances, and then they may also be milking these, but also using them for meat and other products too. And then we also have livestock ranching, which is sort of like herding, except, again, usually the people doing it are sedentary. They're living in a particular place or house and then moving their cows around but staying there, as opposed to herding where they're moving from one place to another. And then the other thing that's becoming more important is urban agriculture. Look at this stat here. In China, urban agriculture now provides 90% or more of all the vegetables consumed in cities. So in other words, their cities are much more self-sufficient in terms of vegetable production, and this is not like talking about rice and wheat and those sort of things. This is vegetables, right? And which typically are grown fairly close to city centers anyway. But other places too, like Cuba, does a lot of urban agriculture, and it's becoming a much more popular thing to do here in the United States too. All right, so again, make sure you do kind of know those different types of agriculture. I know I breezed through it quick. Key point number 3. how agriculture is spatially around markets or around cities. By here markets, we don't just mean like a supermarket, we mean a place where produce and agricultural products are being purchased. And this brings us to what's called the von Thunen model. Von Thunen was a geographer who looked at why, how are different agricultural activities arranged around a city and why. And so he has this model, sometimes referred to as a core periphery, where you have the city as the core and it has it's called a hinterland, or its area around it that basically feeds that city. And so he created this model to look at the effects of distance from the market and on transport costs and also how expensive land was. And so he came up with this theory of kind of concentric rings. And so in this, he shows the central city being here in the middle. And he argued that the next thing you usually see by the city is market gardens and feedlots. Because market gardens, those kind of products are you can get a fairly good price, and also the stuff is heavy. That's why you don't want to do it really far away and transport it into the city, because it's expensive to transport. He argues that then dairy is what you're going to get next, and the reason why is because the milk can go bad. You need to make sure that you keep it fresh, and and it's heavy. Right, milk is heavy, and so it costs a lot to transport. Then he argues that out here you get kind of livestock fattening, and then grain farming a little further out, and then ranching further out, and then you get to this last area where you can't really do agriculture. It's not, where you get non-agricultural land just because you start getting so far away from your market. Now, von Thunen developed this many decades ago, and things have changed. But it still holds a little bit in that if you look at some of the ways agriculture is set up, say in the eastern United States, you do get a lot of market gardens, things like that, close to the major city centers like New York City, New Jersey being called the Garden State. A lot of that was because they did produce a lot of the vegetables and other food products for New York, Philadelphia, the other major urban areas. Here in New England, of course, we have a lot of market gardens as well as dairying because of the proximity to the markets like Boston, New York. Of course, these days, in terms of how well this model works, the real world, of course, is more complicated than the model suggests, and also the emergence of cool chains have collapsed distance. In other words, we can make milk further away because we can keep it cool. Cool chain just means like the ability to transport something and keep it cold the whole time. So it's refrigerated transport, which has really changed then the geography of where you can actually make these products. However, this model still does work relatively well for some undeveloped countries, that don't have a lot of the technology and faster transport networks. So it explains, though, too, why historically you get the kinds of agricultural patterns that you do in a place like the eastern United States, for instance. Okay, key point number 4. Agriculture has changed quite a bit because of the institution of new technologies into agricultural production, particularly in the 20th century. And two of the biggest ones are what's referred to as the Green Revolution and also genetically modified organisms. And the book gets into both of these a little bit. So as we see, there's problems still with hunger in a lot of places, purple here being the worst areas, red being fairly bad. And so there is a need in these areas to try and increase production of food. And so one of the responses to this in the 1960s was something called the Green Revolution. And Green Revolution, as it says here, is the recent introduction of high-yield hybrid crops and chemical fertilizers and pesticides into traditional Asian agricultural systems, most notably paddy rice farming. But it says with the attendant increases in production, but also with ecological damage. Okay. And then it says here that in some countries like India, the Green Revolution really took hold and they really adapted these technologies, but some places have kind of resisted it and not adopted it. The thing with the Green Revolution is that it was actually not just a product or a project to increase food production, it was actually a political project as well. The reason it's called the Green Revolution, like where the name comes from, is actually in response to red revolutions. In other words, it was supposed to be a way to keep communism at bay, right? There was these poor countries in the 50s and 60s that were starting to turn towards communist systems. And a lot of the reaction to that from like the United States and other places was, well, we know that these places are turning into communist areas because they're poor, because people are concerned with income inequality, and because they're literally starving or they don't have enough food. So the American answer was, don't redistribute the wealth, don't do that kind of thing. Instead, increase your production. and that if you increase your production of food and other things, that people will be better off, and then they won't turn to communism as a potential solution. So the Green Revolution really came out of that mindset. And so the idea was that you're not just creating more food, you're doing it in a capitalist way. You're buying the seeds, you're buying the inputs like the fertilizers and the pesticides and all of that. You're able to then grow more food, which you are then selling on the capitalist market. And so one of the things that Green Revolution did was it actually really made income inequality much worse in places like India. Even though more food was produced, what would happen is the richer farmers could afford the technologies, the new seeds, the new inputs and pesticides and all of that. They would produce more, which would essentially drive the smaller producers out of the market. They couldn't compete with these new, bigger producers that were using these Green Revolution technologies. So these farms, the ones that were adopting technologies, were successful. They had more food. The problem was that when they then were going to sell that food, if you've driven other people out of the market in these agricultural areas, they can't buy the food. And so those people actually ended up in some respects worse off because they were usually producing their own food and then a little bit extra to sell. As they were basically being driven out of business, they actually got more poor, whereas the rich farmers that adopted the technologies got richer and richer because they found other markets to sell their food to, whether it was urban markets or international markets. And so in rural India, what it did is it took places that already had some inequality and really made it much, much worse. But it did produce more food for a while. One of the things that we've seen is it increased production rates, and now it sort of peaked and is now actually on the downward slope in terms of the amount being produced per acre. And part of the reasons why is because these technologies can exhaust the soil, make it so that the soil kind of loses its fertility. Also, they're very water intensive, and some parts of places like India then are now having problems with not enough water where this agriculture has been instituted. So even on its own merits of producing more food, it worked for a while, but that's starting to falter a bit, and it also had this impact of having having more income inequality being generated in places where it was adopted. So that's kind of what I talk about here, negative aspects of Green Revolution, right? Poor farmers could not afford it, and kind of that gap widened. And the ecological damage. When you're using fertilizer, when you're using pesticides, it has a lot of damaging impacts on the environment too. And then one of the things that happens is the poor that were in these rural areas that used to be able to feed themselves and have an economic livelihood that don't anymore basically get driven into the urban areas to try and find work or to try and find some kind of livelihood. And it's one of the reasons why a lot of the big cities in the world are growing so fast and have these slums around the outside. It has to do with how uneconomically viable agriculture has become in the rural areas, and so they're being pushed out of the rural areas. It's not just the attraction of the cities, and we'll talk about that when we talk about urban geography in a couple of modules here. But this is an ongoing project. Rural development and the Green Revolution still very much in effect, so I'm going to kind of breeze over that though. And leads to the next point, which is genetically modified organisms. And now this is essentially like the Green Revolution technologies, but taken to another level. Green Revolution technology used what are called hybrid seeds, which is like you take corn and another kind of corn and you breed them together to try and get particular traits. So let's say you have a corn that produces just a lot of kernels, right? A lot of corn, and let's say you have another species that's really drought tolerant, and so you want to make you want to take those two species and merge them together so that you get some of their offspring that are drought tolerant and produce a lot. And so this is kind of a hit or miss thing, because if you know anything about the way genetics works, sometimes one of the traits crosses over and not the other, and so you may end up actually sometimes the offspring of this kind of hybridizing of the corn, you could end up with stuff that instead of being drought resistant and high producing, it could be low producing and not drought resistant. And so you keep selecting for these successful generations of corn that you've made. And the way this research is done is actually you literally take corn and you take the corn stalk and you pollinate one with the other and get the kind of corn mixing that you want, and then you grow that corn, and then you see which type was drought resistant and also, say, producing more, and then you keep selecting those and then interbreeding those until you get more and more of those traits. Genetically modified organisms are completely different in that you are taking the genetic code from a completely different species and using a DNA technology, inserting that into the DNA code of another species. So for instance, one of the things, this picture here of the tomato with a fishtail, is because there's a kind of tomato called a flavor saver tomato where people have taken the genes from a flounder fish and inserted it into the tomato DNA, and it makes the tomatoes stay fresher longer. Doesn't necessarily make them taste any different, but it helps them in terms of survive transportation, so you can grow them in different places and get them to market, and they still look good. The other thing that genetically modified organisms has been done is there's been, let's see if I got it here, is what's called Roundup Ready. I'll get to that in a second. Let me start here. So here's the definition here of genetically modified. It's plants whose genetic characteristics have been altered through recombinant DNA technology, right, from species to species. There is, for those of you who are interested, you can Google this. They're actually glow-in-the-dark cats where they took DNA from, I believe it's jellyfish that have bioluminescence, took some of that DNA and put it into cat DNA, and now you have glow-in-the-dark kittens. And that's actually a real thing. Check it out. But what they do is agribusinesses are able to patent the processes and the resulting genetically engineered organisms and then claim legal ownership over these new life forms. So as opposed to just with hybridizing and corn is just corn and nobody really owns it, when you take this stuff like this DNA from a flounder and put it into a tomato and you figure out how to do that, now you own the genetic code of that tomato, whoever did that, the company. And so this has been a bit of a problem in that they also have something that they call terminator seeds, where they have seeds that will grow a crop, this new genetically modified crop, and then the seeds, though, that produces are sterile. So you can't, as a farmer, take seeds from your own crop and then plant the next year. You have to go back to the company and buy them again. And so it's been very profitable for these companies. The other thing that's been very profitable is an example of what's called Roundup Ready. Roundup Ready soybeans is a very popular kind of soybean, and it's owned by the company Monsanto. And one of the problems is that Roundup is a chemical. Monsanto was a chemical company that got into the biotechnology kind of business after the fact. And what they did is they designed genetically modified soybeans so that you can spray a lot of Roundup on them without killing the soybeans. And Roundup is an herbicide. It's a poison that kills weeds, but also will kill any plant if given enough quantity. So they developed a genetically modified plant that can withstand a whole lot of Roundup. So you buy the Roundup Ready soybeans, you then also buy the Roundup poison, the pesticide, and you use it together, and you're able to then produce more of the soybeans with less weeds. The problem is that there's some concern that this will then have the emergence of what they call super weeds, weeds that have evolved resistance to these high doses of Roundup. And also, you know, the people say, well, this isn't really benefiting humanity, this is benefiting Monsanto and shouldn't really be, you know, why do we benefit from eating soybeans that just have more pesticides than they would otherwise and are genetically modified? So there's a lot of controversy around this, even though it is true that it has increased production. Okay, and I'm back again. I had to change locations yet again because my computer was about to die and had to plug it in. All right. So in terms of the future of GM crops, GM crops are widely used in the United States. If you eat anything with corn, if you go to Taco Bell and get corn, you know, get a what do you call it, taco or whatever, if you're eating cereal, for the most part, you're getting genetically modified food at this point. The U.S. really leads that. Soybean and corn, particularly in the U.S., is really almost all genetically modified at this point. But there are some places that really resist genetically modified foods, like they won't allow them to be imported or the seeds to be planted. Some places like England, Western Europe, Japan have really resisted some of the genetically modified technologies. So this is a map showing, you know, the places where there are certain kinds of genetically modified crops. The U.S. is by far the leader, but places like Brazil, especially with the soybeans and cotton, those kind of things, use a lot of genetically modified species too. Okay, so that is the end of the key points. The other thing just to mention here is make sure that you watch the video, the other video, which is on overfishing. which connects to agriculture, and that it's another kind of primary activity. And obviously, the way a lot of people eat in large parts of the world is through the production of food from the ocean. There's also some slides after this one that make sure that you take a look at too in the PowerPoint. But that is it for this section, and I'll see you next module.